Welcome to Flip the Cap, the industry's premier podcast that delivers insurance insights with a twist. I'm your host, Kathryn Smith, and I'm joined today by Jencap's environmental and energy leaders, Canaan and Loren Henry. Recent tariffs and geopolitical pressures are creating a huge shift in the energy sector. Our experts are here to outline everything you need to know about these impactful sector shifts and their associated insurance implications. Whether you're looking for fresh takes, deeper insights, or a competitive edge, you're in the right place. So let's kick things off with a 30,000-foot view of the energy sector and what shifts you're seeing as a result of geopolitical changes, recent tariffs. There's a lot going on in the world, and of course we're going to toe the politically agnostic line, but we have to sort of set the worldly stage before we can even talk about what the domestic impacts are in the energy sector. So set the stage for us, if you will.
Yeah, great question, Kathryn. I think before we dive into what's going on in the energy sector in particular, I think we need to even step back further and look at global trade and how we're set up and some of the friction that we're seeing from a geopolitical standpoint before we get into energy. So I think we'd probably start in Asia and Southeast Asia. And one of the significant issues that has been all over the news over recent years is the expansion of China's influence throughout all of the South China Sea area. Significant strife with China and the Philippines, creating all of these man-made islands and really looking to exert force, both implied and also direct force. So they're looking to put strain on just trade and control trade in that region. Obviously, a lot of our consumer products are manufactured in China. We have significant trade with China and the entire Southeast Asian region. And with some of the saber rattling and muscle flexing that we're seeing in the South China Seas area, it's putting strain on trade and our consumer products and our ability to consume what they're producing and exporting to us. Now, if we go a little bit more recent, and this starts to kind of segue more into our energy issues, is the conflict in Iran and Iran's control of the Straits of Hormuz, where a significant amount of oil exports are shipped through. It's become quite a powder keg from a global trade standpoint. Then when you get into some of the effects that the tariffs have, it's kind of adding that last straw to the camel's back in an already area that's kind of ready for a flashpoint. I don't know, Loren, do you have anything else to add?
I would just say those factors, and then with the current administration's approach towards tariffs, it's creating a global strain economically across the board. It's inflating costs across the board on numerous goods, and we can get into specifically how that's affecting the oil and gas sector, solar, wind, all of the renewable energy sectors as well.
So I've heard you guys talk about there being some huge pivots, particularly away from solar energy and over to different energy sectors. Talk about what you're seeing, particularly with the deviation away from solar energy, and what alternatively is coming in the door for you.
So during the last administration, and Kathryn, this is one of those subjects where you're kind of dancing between raindrops on talking politics, and I will do my best to stay away from that. But there is going to be some breach into that. But what you'd see in the last administration is quite a bit of support for the alternative energy industries, specifically with some of the subsidies that the federal government and certain states would push out and pass on to both consumers of green energy as well as companies that are actively in the process of trying to expand green energy, like solar. It's interesting when you talk about that. I think over the last couple of years, green energy has mainly been a euphemism for rooftop solar on homes. And I think that's where we're seeing a significant reduction in demand. What we saw on the environmental side, because we write environmental packages for the solar installation contractors, is we saw an exponential increase not only in the number of companies that were installing rooftop solar, but also the year-over-year increase in revenues that all of these solar companies were experiencing. So it's really a two-pronged approach. We saw the increase in revenue, which is due to just the massive influx of consumers that were purchasing solar for their roof. But also there was the cost of sourcing these solar panels. Getting back to the original comment with global trade, a large portion of these solar panels, might I say, virtually all, were coming from Southeast Asia. And together there was so much support. We had cheap sourcing of products that were created overseas. We had very broad trade that was occurring and well-established trade routes with Asia and Southeast Asia. And you had an increase in demand, mainly pushed by some of the federal policies over this last administration. So consumers were quite encouraged to put rooftop solar. Now what we're seeing is a pivot. We're seeing a reduction in that. And I've seen it in both accounts that I have on the books, as well as a significant reduction in the number of new business opportunities for solar installation contractors. To Loren's point, since the passing of the big beautiful bill on July 4th, we've seen a pivot, a significant pivot, regardless of why that is happening, why that tax bill on the removal of subsidies occurred. The result is a significant contraction now in the solar industry.
I think it's important to just touch on a few of the things that were in that bill that are really triggering or being the catalyst of change that we're seeing in the marketplace. And not just in solar, but we're seeing it in oil and gas, coal, and some other renewable energy sectors. And I'll touch on those. But in regard to solar, federal tax credits accounted for 1/3 of the costs for solar and wind projects in the United States. And those are effectively coming off of the table now. So these projects are going to have a 33% increase in cost right out of the gate. The other thing is solar credits. Those are going to end for residential solar credits. Those are going to end December 31st, 2025. Heat pumps and insulation going to end December 31st. Electric vehicle tax credits are going to end September 30th, 2025. So these are immediate changes that are going to have immediate impacts on solar, wind, renewable energy, and the current administration is propping up, trying to support the oil and gas industries as well as coal and natural gas industries. So it'll be interesting to see, what transpires. I think we'll see an immediate uptick in solar installations, especially residential and commercial, just because people are going to want to take advantage of these tax credits before they come off of the table completely. But I think the larger solar farm projects, the wind farm projects, we're going to see a huge decrease in those projects, because if they don't start by a year from now, if they don't actually start digging and doing the construction, they're going to lose those tax credits. And that was something that came out of the big beautiful bill, as well as the Trump administration put an executive order in place on July 7th that kind of expedited that process and drew it back. So effectively they only have 1 year to get those projects started.
So you mentioned at the onset of this conversation, Loren, that a high-level trend in the energy sector is that these tariffs are, of course, driving costs up. Are there particular risk types or project-specific risks that you're seeing having the biggest price increase as you're underwriting deals?
Yeah, I'll touch on that, particularly for oil and gas, and I'll let Canaan jump in. He can talk about the solar industry in particular. But for oil and gas, I think the obvious one is pipe. A lot of pipe is sourced from Europe, Southeast Asia, Asia in general, and the cost to import that pipe have gone up considerably. And that cost gets directly translated to the purchaser, which ends up being our insureds, the subcontractors that are installing the pipe in the oil and gas industry. So their overhead is going up. They're already locked into contracts where their prices are set, their costs are set, and now the costs are going up. So they're actually losing some money in these deals, and they're having to readjust, and it's just creating a headache across the industry. It's in other segments too, equipment, rental equipment. We're talking about truck tractors, dozers, backhoes, those type of things. Those are all increasing in costs. Tools, other types of equipment. So we're seeing it across the board in the industry, particularly with oil and gas. And then Canaan, I know we're seeing those same kind of increases in solar, if you want to touch on a few of those as examples.
Yeah. So the vast majority of solar panels are manufactured in Asia and Southeast Asia. So what we're seeing is a rough increase in between 25 to 45% in the cost to import those solar panels. Obviously, it's always a two-pronged approach. You've got the demand and the supply side, and if demand is waning due to lack of subsidies and top-down federal or state support to consumers to install solar, that's going to put downward pressure on the number of solar projects that are being installed. The other side is supply side. If now the cost of materials has increased significantly, we're at a point where it almost doesn't quite make sense for consumers to put rooftop solar on their homes. And I think it's interesting. We're setting the stage right now on what the problem is, but I also think we need to talk about why. Why is it such a problem, and why is everybody so concerned with how we're sourcing or the mix of our energy supply? And I think it comes down to future demand for energy, and I don't want to kind of jump ahead too much, but there are significant increases to energy demand and consumption patterns coming in the very near future, as soon as 5 years from now. So it's in everybody's best interest to at least monitor what's going on and where we're sourcing our energy from, and then figure out a good combined approach on how we would meet our demands in the future. And solar, while maybe, we went kind of hard in the paint over the last couple of years with installation of solar, I wonder if maybe perhaps the pendulum is swinging a little bit too far away from it, and when there needs to be a more moderated approach to energy diversification and sourcing of energy.
So pivot is kind of like the theme of this conversation, particularly in the energy sector. So a lot of pivoting away from solar, a lot of pivoting towards nuclear and hydroelectric. So with some of these pivots, if you will, are there emerging risks environmentally to what we're being moved to?
Well, that's an interesting question. Yes. So I think here's the concern. I'm going to stay away from carbon,
okay, because
it is such a hotly debated topic. And, I don't know if the format or the length of this podcast.
There's not enough time in the world for that conversation.
Correct. Right.
Yeah, I get it.
But here's what I'll do. I'll talk about hard materials.
Okay.
Here's a great visual. I have kids. Have you ever seen the movie WALL-E, where it talks about, consumption patterns and how eventually you've got all of these people on Earth are sitting on mounds of trash until they, all get on, floating platforms and get above it. One of the things that I think has brought concern is with the massive proliferation of installation of solar panels. What do you do with the waste? Because there is a usable life to those panels, just like everything. Eventually you're going to have to dispose of those panels, and there are environmental concerns. There are metals included in those solar panels, and at this point, we don't have, efficient and effective technology to extract them and truly recycle and reuse or dispose of them. So, what happens is they end up just kind of getting, dumped into landfills. So that's definitely a concern. You also got sourcing of those metals that can be, pretty damaging to the environment. So if we're talking about solar in particular, while there's definitely benefits, it's not the one solution to fix everything. We really do need a more measured approach with a good diversification of sourcing our energy. So with that kind of prelude, I want to talk about what I am seeing an increased, frequency of submissions coming in, and it's research and development of nuclear energy, and in particular, mobile nuclear units. And what's nice about this source of energy is you can produce large quantities of energy. And if some of these companies that have recently been in the news, in fact, one of them in particular was recently in the White House meeting with President Trump, they have invested heavily and bet heavily on the future of these small micro nuclear generation units. What's nice about them is they're mobile. You can take them to some of the largest energy consumption facilities that we're seeing now, which are these data centers. And the increase in the number of data centers we're seeing is being driven basically because of the way we live our lives, because we have a massive increase in our consumption pattern with electricity, with everybody's mobile devices, with frankly the increase in the use of AI. This uses massive quantities of energy, and we're going to need a way to satisfy that demand. So we are seeing in my desk, we're seeing an increase in the number of nuclear R&D facilities as well as enrichment companies performing enrichment. Loren, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I want to stick with that theme of pivoting, Kathryn, and talk about kind of what Canaan was mentioning, what we're seeing in the marketplace from an insurance perspective, and particularly with nuclear. It's interesting the timing of this conversation, and what Canaan was talking about is I actually have a submission in hand that we're working on right now where the client was drilling water wells and now they're pivoting to drilling for uranium, and it's going to be used in these nuclear modules. And interesting timing about that, but it's a very different exposure, and so it's different markets will write it. So we had to pivot the insured from sort of group A of insurance companies, and now we're looking at group B list of insurance companies because A and B don't offer coverage for the same exposures. And then even on a more global level there, why are companies switching to drilling for uranium? Because the administration is giving more support financially through tax credits and incentives and grants for companies to source that material locally instead of being dependent on the global market, instead of importing it from Asia, Asian countries, Europe, Africa, wherever else it might be coming from. And that's one of the things that we're finding in this big, beautiful bill is there's incentive, there's push, there's more demand to source those materials locally, and they're disincentivizing people and companies from bringing those materials in from overseas, from other countries. And there's a handful of particular company or countries that they don't want those materials sourced from. And that's a different podcast that can get into those countries. But just in general, this pivot is because I think in part of this administration's desire to do things for ourselves here in this country. And whether you agree with that or not on a global level or domestically, we are doing it. We are seeing companies pivot immediately, and there is more support as that pendulum shifts from maybe going fully green, fully renewable. We're swinging back towards more support for oil and gas, more support for the natural gas industry. And my question going forward is, how are the states going to respond? How is California going to respond to the federal government saying we want more oil and gas production and less renewable? How is New York going to respond? Texas, Kansas, everybody's got their own nuances about energy production, where it comes from, how we do it, and how it impacts the environment. So I'm just kind of curious, Canaan, if you have any thoughts on how these states might approach permitting for oil and gas, for natural gas versus renewable energy, and what those implications might be.
Yeah, great question. Man, that's another one. It's kind of like carbon. It's such a hotly debated topic, and everybody has such emotion about it. I don't know if I could really have an opinion there, but here's what I do know. I do know that demand is increasing dramatically. So, for example, within the next 5 years, by 2030, the estimates for peak hour demand is going to be 100 gigawatts. Currently, we have the production capability for 22 gigawatts at peak demand hours. That's a shortfall about 78 gigawatts. I'm not sure where you get that amount of energy. Now, I know there's been quite a bit of focus on natural gas. And while we might be able to close some of that shortfall with domestic natural gas, I don't know if we can meet all of that demand. It really has to be a holistic approach from numerous different ways to generate energy. The other concern that we're going to have is, how do you distribute that energy once it's produced? So these natural gas facilities are fixed facilities, just like our coal-fired power plants, even our large nuclear power plants. These are fixed facilities. We already have an incredibly strained grid, and there's essentially three main grids. You've got an East Coast, I'm oversimplifying, but you have an East Coast, a West Coast, and a Texas grid. How do you distribute that energy to everybody? What happens if you have bottlenecks and pinch points? How do you actually address that and get adequate amount of power to the consumers that are demanding that energy? Again, hence the need for these small nuclear reactors, which might fix that. Getting back to natural gas, it's maybe looking at too short term of a solution versus looking down the line, and how are we going to actually meet what everybody needs. It's got to be a measured, balanced approach from many different energy sources. And my feeling is, I don't think we're focusing enough on diversification of energy. While I like the paradigm of America First and making sure that we are developing domestic energy, which does include natural gas and some coal, it may be a little bit too short-sighted, and it may not meet the actual demand we need in a very short time period.
Unfortunately, we need to wrap things up. We could sit here and talk about this for literally hours, because there's so many nuances to this topic and we've barely scratched the surface. So I definitely feel a part two coming on in the next month or two as things, continue to evolve. But I'd love to hear from both of you as we wrap things up today. Just if you're a retail agent navigating this landscape with clients that are in these particular industries, what advice do you have for them to navigate the pivot here?
I think what it comes down to is specialization matters. Working with insurance professionals that truly understand the risk and also have the relationships and experience to get accounts placed. With so much turmoil in the industry, it really is important to work with folks that are keyed in to some of the changes that are going on right now.
Yeah, I'd add, I'll even get a little more granular. I think working with underwriters and insurance carriers that are willing to be flexible as we move through these changes in oil and gas, in renewable energy, and specifically, check in with your underwriter at 3 months, 6 months into the policy period. Check in with the insured on those same frequencies See if a midterm audit is needed. See if it's available. When you're going to bind coverage, is that an auditable policy? Is it locked in for the entire year? Asking those questions, being proactive about potential changes coming down the road and getting ahead of the problem instead of chasing it will make retail agents, wholesalers, everybody involved in that process look much better to the client. And it also puts the client in a much better position at the end of the policy term.
You know, Loren, that just triggered a thought, and it's a great point. With unstable revenues, regardless of what type of energy risk that you're working on, considering maybe an auditable policy might actually make sense, provided that there's, not too high of a minimum end deposit, and there is some chance of getting premium back if revenue expectations don't meet, what you thought they might. It's interesting. It used to be a benefit to have a non-auditable policy. And you make a great point. We might be in a business environment right now where going towards or trending towards an auditable policy in some cases could make sense.
Kathryn, sorry, I just want to add one more thing and again, I think if we do a part 2, this kind of leads into it. So maybe a little bit of a tease here, but, going back to your discussion earlier, Canaan, about the mobile nuclear modules, the small nuclear devices, in my mind, it prompted a question. And last year, you and I talked about the implications that the renewable green energy movement was having on the environment and environmental insurance. I think we can go there too. And the next discussion is, what is that nuclear waste production from those nuclear modules going to look like? Where is that being stored? How is it being transported? What are the environmental implications of that? So I think we can definitely do a part 2 here.
You set it up way too well. Well, thank you both so much for your insights. I know that it's a delicate dance to talk about these topics because they are so politically charged, but they are topics that have huge insurance implications and ones that our retailers need to understand and to be able to navigate themselves as they're working with their clients. So I think that you certainly helped everyone do that. You are tuned in to Flip the Cap, the industry's premier podcast that delivers insurance insights with a twist. Today, a little extra twist. We'll see you next time. Cheers.